Okay, on Monday, we talked about installing and kind of overview of DNS. Today is managing and administering DNS in the Server 2008. There are a number of things that we'll do in this chapter, you'll do in this chapter. There are a number of activities. They're all like 10-minute activities. So if you had 20 10-minute activities, that's 200 minutes, that's less than 3 hours. It's going to take more than 10 minutes to do some of that stuff because you got to do, occasionally got to do reboots and stuff like that. But there are a lot of them. None of them are really all that complex. This one kind of focuses on how DNS and Active Directory work together. And I've said it before too many times, say it again. If you don't have DNS working with Active Directory, it isn't going to work. In a single environment, not that big a deal. It's a single server, not that big a deal, because all you do is use your own DNS to store the resource records. When you put that second server in, you join the second server of the domain, or you become a member server, and in Chapter 1 you became a member server so that you could do the WDS. You have to have DNS get its information from the location that has the resource records. And that's why I say imagine where the packet's going to get that information, and is it there? Can you actually do anything with it from that location? So the objectives: describe and install Active Directory domain services. You've done that before. Do it again here. Install the binaries and then install the Active Directory services. When you do this, be careful of the exact instructions, following the instructions exactly in the book, because he has everybody using the same IP address. Well, we know that ain't going to work. And I think the reason is in the Microsoft course world, they always have you using virtual machines and isolated on your desktop and everybody in their own little networking world so they can't see each other. To me, again, to use your own DNS server, the easiest address to use is 127.0.0.1 because it's always going to point to the local host regardless of what the IP address is. Manage your DNS environment. In this one, troubleshoot your DNS environment. DNS is another one of those that basically it either works, to me it either works or it doesn't work. There's a test it out. The easiest way to test it out is can you resolve resources? And if you can't resolve resources, think through logically what's asking what to get the information. Just like kind of did yesterday, the conditional forwarder, and we'll talk about conditional forwarders here, or the not. Can you get somewhere based on where it's getting the information from? Manage WINS, Windows Internet Name Service, which originally they said they weren't going to put WINS in here. In the very first course that I took, there was no WINS. You can now install a WINS server. The operating system doesn't need it, but you may have applications that do need it. So it's good to know about it. It's like everything else. Install the role, and then in the IP configuration information, we'll get all these abbreviations sorted out here in a minute. Point to a WINS server. The machines will automatically register themselves, except for Linux machines. Linux has no concept of WINS, and when you see the WINS server in a trace, in a packet trace, a Wireshark trace, it's going to show up as NBNS, NetBIOS name server. It won't show up as WINS. So you see NBNS, that is a NetBIOS name server. That's what that one is about. New features of DNS in Windows Server 2008. And I think that the new features are kind of like a lot of the old features, but the one thing that they did change, and it's sitting right out there in the front, and I'll tell on myself, I wanted to do a conditional forwarder, and it's sitting right out there with a little folder that says conditional forwarder. I didn't see it. I went into the old configuration and said, where the heck are the forwarders? Where are the conditional forwarders? Forwarders, conditional forwarders. can help you out a lot, and you kind of need to know what those do. Active Directory clients use DNS to locate all the resources available, the resources, the SRV records. And we've said this before, when you log on here in the morning, and occasionally if the ports don't wake up or the NICs don't wake up, you'll get a response back that said, no authentication servers available. If DNS is configured improperly, you may get the same message, because if your workstation can't find a domain controller, then it can't authenticate you. It finds the domain controller by using the SRV, the resource record, in DNS. When you install Active Directory, and I know we've done that before, but take a look at what those records look like, just to kind of get them in your head what's there. If you don't have the resource records, and you should get 4 folders in the zone, if you don't have those resource records, then Active Directory is not working effectively. 2 ways to kind of force it: if you point it to the wrong place, change where your domain controller gets the information so that it can populate those records. You can use the net space stop net logon service and the net space start net logon service. The net logon service does a number of things. One of the things that it does is transfers, loads, updates, whatever term you want to use, but if you don't have those records, net logon is the one that puts those records into DNS so that DNS can then do them. It also, Active Directory integrated zones, stores the information not in the text file in the DNS area on the hard drive, but it stores those resources in Active Directory. All the replication of those resources take place in Active Directory, not in the DNS replication process. Can you make one of those Active Directory integrated zones a secondary read-only zone at a new location? Yes, you can do that if you need to store them that way. Generally, they're going to be Active Directory integrated zones. You're going to have the opportunity when you install them which DNS servers to update with them. All of them in this domain, all of them in this forest, or whichever ones that you pick. Servers can run in the Active Directory Directory Services environment, standard servers, Active Directory integrated DNS servers. When you create a primary zone, and when you install Active Directory, I know I keep saying when, and I keep backing up. When you install Active Directory, theoretically, it's going to create the zone for you, whatever it is. And in this one, Bentech, and I think again, Bentech D or N, and then your server number, whatever number you're using, so that everybody's got a different one. This is another one. He's got everybody having the same IP address, everybody joining the same domain. That won't work. The domains need to be different. So to do that, D goes, got a day class and a night class, D, whatever the number is. I don't care if you put a 0 in it or not. What the objective is to get everybody to be in a different location so that we don't have all the interference and everything actually works. But DNS can run in an Active Directory services environment. On the standard server, the integrated zones, and that's where I was going on it. The primary zones, once you have Active Directory installed, will default to Active Directory integrated. If you don't want it to be Active Directory integrated, just uncheck the checkbox at the bottom of the Make the New Zone. If, by chance, you get done and you do all that stuff and then you look in DNS and golly, your zone's not there, just make the zone, whatever the domain name you gave to the machine. If it doesn't populate itself, use the net start and the net stop. If that doesn't work, try a reboot. The net start and the net stop is quicker than rebooting the system. The command prompt, all these great things. Connection to the DNS suffix local domain, and that should automatically get populated. I think that he has gone through and talked about the domain searches and which domain do you want to be appended to the machine so that you wind up being a fully qualified domain name instead of a net bias name, a single name lookup. Directory services infrastructure. By the way, Microsoft did try to buy, as far as I know, at least rumors that I've heard, NetWare's directory service before NetWare kind of went under. NetWare's directory service is a true directory service. Active Directory is kinda. It does not meet the standards of a true directory service. It looks like it's hierarchical, and everything appears hierarchical, but it's really not. And what does that mean to you? That when you start creating users in a domain, even if you have them in separate OUs, you can't have two J. Smiths in a domain. You could have J. Smith 1, J. Smith 2, or whatever else. If you had a truly hierarchical directory structure and they were in different OUs, and that would be the way they were named, you could have a J. Smith in each OU. So it appears to be hierarchical. It's built along the standards of a real directory service, but it's not truly there. Stores attributes and specific information for the objects within the network. The attributes, I like to think about them as the blanks, and the attributes are the blanks, and the values are you filled in the blank. The blank is like your username, your first name, your last name, your address, whatever else that you want to put into these things. And when you look at the attributes that are available, if you look at a local user versus a domain user, the domain user has many, many, many more attributes than does a local user. And as you add stuff like Exchange Server, you add more attributes so that you can manage the email information centrally from the server itself. The zone additions, and I think these are in the book, the MSDCS forest name, Microsoft-specific subname specifies the domain controllers that have the Windows Server specific roles. That's one that you should see, and then you're going to have a lot of other information in there. I only wanted to point that one out. You should have a separate zone by that name when you create a root domain. And the root domain is the first one installed, so all of you are going to be root domains, not going to be child domains. By the way, well, with you guys installing it wouldn't be an issue, but if you use all of the machines, which I tend to do on the tests, out of the same machine, then they all have the same SID. You can't make child domains. It just kind of goes around in a circle. They used to have this really cool, and I probably talked about it, for 2003 Windows XP, this really cool utility called New SID that you can get. New SID doesn't work in Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008. What you have to do is use sysprep. You can use sysprep to take all of the SID information out. Domain controller locator, excuse me, runs at logon to provide a client with the location of the domain controllers that can authenticate its requests. Again, DNS related. Active Directory domains has a naming convention based on the DNS domain name. Here I'm lcoldarn.roanoke.ecpivab.edu or at whatever. And if you use what I've found out, well, you guys have a different one. You have to use the at. My little Nook doesn't have a backslash. You ever notice that? Because to log on to the email, here what we typically do is username or Roanoke /username, just like you do when you log on to the virtual machines. If you don't have that, you've got to use your username at the domain where you're being authenticated at. And our domain is roanoke.ecpivab.edu, which just makes it a lot longer typing because it didn't have the backslash in that particular one in the Nook. I know, didn't really care, right? But the domain names, whatever we name them, and your domain names are going to be bentecd whatever .local. Please use the .local. I've used in the textbooks the ones that they specify, and occasionally you come up on something that really exists out there, and it kind of can get a little confusing because DNS says, oh yeah, I found it out here on the internet, and then it gets cached. Once it gets cached, that's the IP address that it has until you delete the cache. .local, just like the private IP address, is designed for internal use for domains. So the .local is the private domain name, just like the 192s and the 10s and the 172.16s are private IP addresses as a private domain extension. DNS requires for Active Directory, when a domain is added, the SRV and A records are created to allow the clients to find the domain controller during logon. If you don't have the SRV record, and what I have found is typically the A record will be there regardless. The SRV records may be the ones you're missing, and that's what's in those 4 folders that get created automatically for you. Do you have to use a Windows server for this? No. Can you use a Linux server? Yep, but you're probably going to have to create a lot of records. It's easier to use Windows because it'll automatically generate all that stuff for you. And Active Directory will automatically populate it for you. So data stored in a database, the name resolution, DNS role stores the domains, the domain objects, including the users, computers, and groups in the AD role. The DNS role stores the DNS zones and the resource records. So the Active Directory role has Active Directory has its own database, which, by the way, is an LDAP database at its heart. That's why, and I know I've asked the question before, try to bring some of these things back up. Why the heck can you just use your domain credentials to log on to Moodle? Moodle's an open source piece of software. It's running on a Linux server in a virtual machine at Virginia Beach. How does that work? What they've done is configured it to use the LDAP database that is at the heart of Active Directory. And you can configure those things. We have a server that's in our domain. We have 2 domain controllers here. A third domain controller is at Virginia Beach. That's the one that it actually queries for your credentials. Which means that if we make a change here, you got to either manually replicate or wait until that information gets replicated to Virginia Beach. Replication can become an issue. Theoretically, it shouldn't, but it can become a password anyway, but it can. Shouldn't become an issue, but it may at times. If it does, and you're working in an environment, go do manual replications of all your domain controllers to get all the databases updated without waiting for the regular cycle to go through. Benefits of Active Directory DNS: faster and more efficient replication, because the replication is not DNS replication. If you remember when we talked about that yesterday, you can control when it replicates. It does an IXFR after it does the full replication, it only replicates the changes. This one uses the Active Directory replication, which inside a domain, it's nearly instantaneous, like within 5 minutes. Outside a domain, the default replication is every 60 minutes, which means that Roanoke would replicate with ECPI VAB, separate domain, separate site, every 60 minutes. If you need those things to go there, you're going to have to sit down and do manual replication. And it says, oh yeah, this is not inside the domain. When I get around to it, I'll do it for you, but I know you asked. Database security: when you configure the domains, the zones to do secure, non-secure, or both updates, the secure means Active Directory, means that it's got to be part of Active Directory before it can do the updating. Multi-master support for updates and replication. Multi-master, we talked about in the server course. Multi-master means that all of the domain controllers can be read-writes, and they have a scheme so that they bring all of the domain controllers into convergence. Loose convergence is what they say, because there's always going to be somebody making another change. You can choose one of the following: zone replications options, directories, services, DNS zones. And these are to all DNS servers in this forest, to all DNS servers in this domain, to domain controllers in this domain for Windows 2000 compatibility. When they have you do these things, they ask you to install it, and you might as well install it as a 2008 forest. Functional level server 2008, because there is one advantage to that, and that becomes later in Chapter 7 with DFS. DFS has some more functionality in the 2008 functional level than it does in the 2003 functional level. When you do these things, there's no need to do 2000 compatibility because we don't have any Windows 2000 domain controllers in this. And we don't have any in our domain. I don't know about the rest of the eCPI world. And we certainly don't have any in the course that we're using here. Directory services site structure. Notice that this is DNS zones. This is an awful lot about site structure. Sites are designed to limit replication traffic across wide area network links. What you do when you set up replication, and remember this DNS replication for Active Directory Integrated is going to be Active Directory replication. You configure each site, and a site is called well-connected. Well-connected means LAN speed. Now we use sites so that we can find authentication servers basically, as well as to control replication across a wide area network. And I told you this story about that Buddy Chu used to tell about being in Seattle, right? I think it was Seattle. A bunch of people came in the morning, a bunch of them got authenticated straight away, and a bunch of them had to wait and wait and wait. The ones that had to wait and wait and wait were on the backup domain controller, which happened to be in Bombay, India. What sites do for you is you define sites by subnet. All that subnetting and supernetting that you love to hate comes back. Here we define our site as 10.60 because everything starts with 10.60 with a 16-bit subnet mask. That way we don't have to put in 10.60.211, 10.60.208, and then if we decide to add another network, we don't have to say, oh yeah, I got to go put that one in my site list now. Supernetting helps you out there. But in a site, inter-site replication is managed by one function. Intra-site replication is managed by another function. Intra-site, the machines replicate again almost immediately. I think that to say within 5 minutes, changes should be replicated intra-site within a site. Inter-site, we can control which machines. It sets up a process called bridgehead servers, which says that Chris is the bridgehead server, and he's at Roanoke. And Taylor's the bridgehead server, and he's at Greenville or whatever. When we need to replicate information from Roanoke to Greenville, the bridgehead servers exchange that information based on the update schedule that we have. Once Chris gets the information from Greenville, from Taylor's machine at Greenville, he then updates all the Roanoke domain controllers so that you don't have all the domain controllers on the wide area network taking up traffic. Wide area networks have gotten faster. Know that this is still the way that replication will be set up. If you don't do anything, Active Directory will pick a bridgehead server for you. If you want to pick a specific server, you can do that yourself in the configuration, in the Active Directory configuration. Distribution, how the network is administered, helps determine the layout of your DNS server, distribution of an IT department. And I keep going back to our eCPI because it's pretty well distributed. We have a headquarters in Virginia Beach. We have a network administrator here who has to comply with the policies from Virginia Beach. There's another one at Raleigh, at Greensboro, Greenville, all those different places. So how is it managed? How do you set it up? Ours got set up as a parent domain and then child domains at each of the sites, which means that policies and management takes place at each of the sites, and sites have to be defined. Forwarding, hopefully we made a point about that earlier. Standard and conditional. Standard just says that, hey, if I don't have it in my zones, which means that if I don't have it as an authoritative zone, then ask somebody else. Conditional means that if I don't have it, then ask for this domain somebody else. And one of the things that I think that I asked you to do in these things to kind of prove that is on your virtual servers, try to ping RKE dc1.roanoke.ecpivab.edu. It shouldn't work because based on the DNS process, since it won't be listed in your zones, you're not authoritative for it, where's it going to go to get that information? Where's the process? Where's the first stop? Go and check the cache. Okay, it's not there. Go and check all. Yeah, it's absolutely right. Go and check the cache. Go and check the host file. It's not there. Where is it going to go in the outside world to get that information? Where's the first stop? In the iterative lookup process. We'll give us more hints. Or we're going to have to go back and redo that one. Go to the root. And the root's going to refer it to the edu top-level domain. And the edu top-level domain, in this case, is probably going to say, Houston, we have a problem because it's not going to have an ECPIVAB listing. It'll have an ECPI listing, have a Skyline listing, but it won't have an ECPIVAB because that's the internal domain name. So it's going to give you an error. Golly, does that mean that you can't get any information about the ecpivab.edu domain till you fix DNS? Yeah, that's what it means. How do you fix DNS? Conditional forwarder that says, hey, for ecpivab.edu, ask, and I think in this case 10.60.1.4, which is a domain controller, or domain controller. It is a domain controller, but it's got a DNS running Active Directory integrated zones that has that information. And then you should be able to resolve those resources. But conditional forwarder says only for that domain ask this server. Don't send everything there. If we just had a forwarder, it would send all requests that aren't conditional to someplace else. And conditional forwarders will override a standard forwarding, so that if you have just a forward everything and then a conditional forwarder, it'll send the conditional stuff to the server and the other stuff someplace else. And this is the forwarding process. DNS query, bentech.net, primary for bentech.net sends the query to MSN and all those other things, but the process that we talked about, conditional forwarding, they're using other ones. I like to use the ones that we're using because it is complex enough of a setup that there are certain things that you're not going to be able to resolve until you get DNS fixed in order to do that. And once you get DNS fixed, then you can run from the command prompt //rke-storage1.roanoke.ecpivab.edu and log on and get to your home directory from your virtual machine, because that's where they are. But you got to be able to resolve the resource. And until you get DNS fixed, you can't resolve the resource. Then you can get to your home directory from your virtual machine. I was supposed to say that, Emma. How does networking work and how does DNS work? DNS really is a big deal. Dynamic DNS that we beat to death the other time, supported DNS clients allows them to update their records in DNS so that Patrick doesn't have to be here at 4 o'clock in the morning to put in all 200 machines in DNS after he starts them. Much better if they register themselves. And everything after Windows 2000 can register itself. Some DNS configuration is done in DHCP, and this is one of them. And there's just a checkbox there that says, hey, if it can't register itself, if it doesn't ask for whatever, send it to Active Directory, where the DHCP Active Directory DNS, where the DHCP server updates the DNS server for those resources. Windows 98, Windows NT 4.0. Oh, let's say maybe Linux machines. Do Linux machines register themselves in Active Directory? Probably not going to happen. Can you configure the DHCP server so it does that for you? Yes. The only difference is that the DHCP server then owns the DNS record instead of the computer. And you can do some other configurations with it. To update their 4A and pointer records, deletes the records of the clients removed from the domain whose DHCP lease expires. and that's kind of handy, that you delete the DNS record when the lease expires, and you can configure it if you go into the advanced configurations of the zone and look at the properties that are there. Configure your Windows machines to remove the DNS listing when they log off, not necessarily when the lease expires. Scavenging is a process the DNS checks for old records, expired records, so that it can delete them. Not everything gets deleted on time, so you should configure scavenging in order to delete the records that you don't need anymore. Register DNS, IP config register DNS. If you have a machine, and that's what I was looking for, that's what I thought this one was, a machine that didn't get registered in DNS, IP config register DNS should register it in the DNS server that's in the properties of the NIC on that machine. DHCP, we've talked about that. Provides some dynamic, DHCP provides some dynamic DNS configurations that you can use. Configured at the DNS zone level. We have DNS configuration dynamic updates at the DNS zone level, how we're going to do that. In each of these things, DHCP and DNS, you're going to have server configurations and you're going to have zone configurations. If you have something, and go back to DHCP, you're going to have scope. In the scope, you're going to have scope options and server options. If every machine that gets information on a scope on that server gets the same DNS server, for instance, just configure a server option. You don't have to worry about it with the scope. The scope will inherit the server options. The scope options, if you have something different, the scope options will override the server options. Same thing here. There are some server options and some zone options available in these things. Secure and non-secure updates. Only authenticated clients, secure authenticated clients, we're talking Active Directory. Non-secure, any client. The non-secure performed by any client could mean that somebody would put a record into your DNS that you might necessarily not want. In security, we try to do some spoofing, some DNS spoofing, and that's really what you would do. What if I put a record in there that would send somebody to some other location when they thought they were going to some secure resource that we had, and all of a sudden it sends you someplace else. So secure, non-secure. Secure is the preferred, and in the options you got secure, non-secure, or secured at both. But you would prefer secure updates. And if everything's in the Active Directory environment, use the secure updates. That's what that is for. Failure to point your client to the internal DNS servers can cause problems, and I guess that I've said that so many times, hopefully you believe it by now. If DNS isn't working, Active Directory isn't working. If DNS isn't configured correctly, Active Directory isn't working. Group policy settings that don't use the DHCP, client group policy settings, a number of those, and 2008 server has more group policy settings, what they say, 700 I think in the last class more than the old ones do. So there are a number of DNS client settings that you can put into Active Directory if you want to use it that way, that are different than the DHCP configuration. The GUI, the console, and the DNS console, you can get it through the server manager or through the administrative tools. The GUI itself, access to the DNS zones available for the servers where you can configure information. DNS manager allows you to add DNS servers. When you do configurations and you add a service and you want to manage your DNS servers centrally, you can add DNS servers to the console and manage them all from a single location. And you can do all of that if you add the tools pack. You can do that from a workstation also. DNS server, create a default application, create a zone that says aging and scavenging. They're going to have you do all of those things. The things that are configured at the server level. Notice that aging and scavenging, the scavenging stale resource records is not a zone configuration, but is a server configuration that's inherited into the zones. Zone level, level where the DNS zones exist at the record level, modify and delete the records. Define the security settings of all DNS records in the zones. The zones are configured for secure and non-secure updates. Managing scavenging settings for a record, you can do that in there, and setting a record time to live. How long is that DNS record going to be good for? Because they are going to time out. You have to do refresh of them. You want refreshing of them occasionally. I think I've referred to round robin before to configure load balancing on servers. Well, in round robin, what you do is create two records that have the same IP address with different names. Excuse me. Two records that have the same name and different IP addresses. And then you go into the record and configure it for round robin. And when a request comes in for that resource, DNS gives the first user, give Trevor the first IP address, and then give Jason the second IP address. And then give Chris the first IP address, and then give Taylor the second IP address. And then give Patrick the first IP address. So it changes based on the DNS queries which of the servers, and if you have busy web servers, that's what you want to do. The Googles of the world and the Yahoos of the world use something similar to this. It's not just the DNS round robin. They are actually looking for the closest servers because they're in different geographic locations. DNS command, DNS CMD command, can be used to disable or enable a round robin of DNS. The DNS CMD command is the one that's used to the command line command for configuring DNS. Conditional forwarding, been there, done that. Do you get it on conditional forwarding, or do I need to go through that again? Conditional forwarding forwards for a specific zone, a specific domain. ECPI VAB. With that, in ours, if we were looking for the Roanoke stuff and things might change, we could forward for ECPIVAB.edu, and then it would be Roanoke, Greenville, Raleigh, whatever else. Any of those would be forwarded to that 10.60.14 net or DNS server so that it could get that information. If you have a distributed infrastructure like we do, that knowing about that becomes relatively big deal because you can't get to the other resources until you can resolve the fully qualified domain name. And you can't do that until you can get a DNS record, and you get that through a forwarding of some sort. You don't want to do standard forwarding because then it forwards everything to that. You want your own servers to do the work. Troubleshooting, they got logs in there, filter tabs, general tabs, and they have configurations. And I don't know if they still do, but when I took, I guess it was the 2003 test, they actually asked how you would configure these tabs in order to get the DNS information that you needed or wanted in the troubleshooting area. So you configure it for requests, replies, both, whatever else, so that it gets logged. Only the things that you need get logged. And then the filter tab. The command line utilities, the same ones that we talk about in every course, the ping utility. Can we get somewhere? IP config, the switches, all. Flush DNS, display DNS, register DNS are and that's not all the switches obviously, those are the DNS switches. That you can see what's cached. You can get rid with the flush DNS, or you can register DNS, registers your machine in the DNS server. DC Diag, perform diagnostic queries on your domain controllers. This is a utility that probably want to try out, see what it does, find information. NS Lookup is a utility that, as a network administrator, you should have some knowledge of so that you can do, and what it is a DNS test. NS Lookup says, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm a DNS server. What can I find out about that? You can set which DNS server you want to do the lookup from, and they're going to have you do those things. I believe that one of the, again, errors, and I think that I put it in the, at least I didn't see it, one of the errors in this thing is he wants you to do an DNS lookup on your DNS server and then do the ls command. All you Linux guys, it makes sense, right? The ls command. To list the A records, well, unless you allow zone transfers, it ain't going to happen, because it's going to give you an error message, something like you can't get a zone transfer. You have to go in and configure your server to allow zone transfers before you can list those things. And what that does is point out you really don't want zone transfers available on your servers, because that then allows hacker Trevor to come in and find out what all of your IP listings are. He's shaking his head. Okay, we'll have hacker Jason come in and find out, dump your listings. By default, zone transfers aren't allowed. You have to configure them to allow them. And that's to make secondary zone, to do an NS lookup dump, any of those. You have to turn that on. Yeah, because if I want to have a secondary zone, for instance, if Virginia Beach wants us to have a secondary zone, then they have to allow that zone transfer. Now, it's not just like turn it on and say anybody can do it. That's one of the options. Transfer to any DNS server, or to transfer to only to these DNS servers, so that if I had something that was authoritative, let's say in Roanoke, and all of a sudden we had a, let's grow real fast, we had a branch location in Martinsville for Jody, and we wanted to give the resources from the Roanoke site to the Martinsville site. We could either do a conditional forwarder. So there's more than one way to do any of these things. We could do a conditional forwarder from Martinsville, and it would look here, right? Or we could do a zone transfer, a secondary zone, read-only zone in Martinsville, and transfer the information out of the Roanoke zone to Martinsville. But by default, that wouldn't be allowed. You have to go in and configure and say, hey, yes, I want to allow zone transfers, but I only want to allow it to the IP address of the Martinsville server. Or you can say, if you really want to live dangerously, say to all servers. You don't want to do that. Unless you're doing it like I do from the Ranger server for educational and testing purposes, because it's not available outside. It's DNS, its port 53 is not available to go outside of here. So you guys can do it. We can do it on the virtual machines, and then I use that one a lot for demonstration and for testing to do zone transfers. Gives you an idea. You're going to have to do a zone transfer, right? And it's configured to allow it to any server, but that's not always going to be the case. Shouldn't be the case. Just pictures on what's going on these things, the TTL, NS lookup, debug, Cengage, and they do that, and then after you go through theirs, I think I asked you to look something up in what are the name servers for ECPI, EDU, and they are there. You can find those things just to go through, because a lot of times I think you go through and you follow the clicks and it works really great. Now let's go see if we can find something for real. And what NS lookup does is tests DNS for you. Debug log, capture the packet, the different switches in the NS lookup. WINS, Microsoft technology for resolving NetBIOS names to IP addresses. NetBIOS basically is the computer name that you have. Single name lookup, not fully qualified domain names. What happens here is once you configure a WINS server on a machine, configure a WINS server in the DHCP properties, when the computer comes on, it registers itself with a WINS server, so you can use the single name lookups. You can use the same bridgehead server relationship if you have different locations to do that, and that's where bridgehead servers actually started, was with WINS and NT4 before we got so involved with fully qualified domain names and DNS. When Windows 2008 server 2008 came out, they said, we're going to put a Win server in it. Well, they did. So the first course that I did didn't have, the betas didn't have, that we were using didn't have Win servers. You had to configure a zone in DNS. It was called a single name lookup or something like that in order to do your Wins lookups. Do you necessarily need this? No. Before Chris left, I asked him about ours. He said, well, I turned the Win server off. So we finally got down in this building so that we don't have any applications that require Wins. The operating system doesn't. The operating system needs a fully qualified domain name to find the service records, to find the resource records. Wins might be necessary for some of your applications. How do you know which applications? Turn off your Win server and see what breaks. We used to have an issue with, I think that it was with the, and they updated it, was with the antivirus software and with the view testing software. The view testing software needed a Win server. They've updated each of those that they use. They don't use NetBIOS information anymore. They use fully qualified domain names, DNS information. So the Win service is another one that you add as a role. You don't have to do a whole lot unless you have Linux machines. If you have Linux machines, you're going to have to go in and put manual registrations for them because Linux doesn't understand anything about NetBIOS. So Linux, yep, got to go in, got to put manual registrations in. These things will register and unregister themselves when you start up and shut them down. DNS on the core server can deploy a single or multi-role server running DNS, so you can put it on core, and they have that support for IPv6 and support for IPv6, the 4A records and the resolution process there. A primary read-only zone on read-only domain controllers. Read-only domain controllers is a new old concept because in the real old days with PDCs and BDCs, the BDC was a read-only domain controller. Problem was it could be promoted to a read-write domain controller. The read-only domain controllers that we use now are much more stringently controlled than the old ones were. You control through your full DNS or full Active Directory what resource records, what records get replicated to the RODC. So that if with Jody at Martinsville, somebody walks in and steals the read-only domain controller, we can make it go away. We don't have any resource records on it. And oh, by the way, when you take a RODC out of Active Directory that's been stolen, it automatically requires a password change on all of the usernames that were stored there, so that you're not going to be able to log on with it. It automatically requires that when you do that. Kind of one of those neat things. Link local multicast name resolution. Simple message to verify they have a unique name on the local subnet. That's one of the reasons that we need to rename everything when we start these machines, and domains need to be different. So they're checking to see if they have a unique name. They're also checking to see if they have a unique IP address. Background zone loading. The background zone loading, yeah, that's really neat, but unless you have something that's really big, the size zones that we're using now aren't really going to make that much different. But large zones, huge Active Directory environments, that can be an issue. Immediately, instead of waiting for the entire zone to load. It's kind of like switch forwarding, right? As soon as it gets the information that it needs, it does that, and it will resolve before everything's loaded. So I guess what I'd like for you to take away from this one is DNS really got to work for Active Directory to work, and this chapter kind of focuses on that, how it integrates the resource records, where are the lookups from, the conditional forward. Conditional forwarders really kind of revolve around if we have two companies that merge, or let's say HP and Compaq. These are not some place that you're going to go in and make 15 users and everything's going to be right. Each of them probably got, what, 10, 15, 50,000, 100,000 employees. When you start thinking in those terms, how are we going to make this work becomes a much bigger problem than when we sit down and let's make 3 users on our server, or let's make this work with 2 servers or whatever else. But let's say we got 100,000 employees and 200 domain controllers and maybe 60 or 70 child domains. You need to know how to make the system work for you in order for that to work. And when these companies come together, now we want to share resources. We got to be able to do trusts and allow people in the HP domain get access to resources in the Compaq domain, and they've got to be able to resolve through DNS all of those resources. So forwarders, conditional forwarders, and all that other configuration that we've talked about here becomes a more significant problem when you do those things, or a more significant issue. More significant challenge becomes more significant. Active Directory services uses domain controllers to store the Active Directory objects and information about the environment. Active Directory integrated zones are not going to be in the DNS, the .dns file on the hard drive. It's going to be in Active Directory. Replication is going to be through Active Directory. DNS implementations, forwarders we talked about, dynamic DNS for supported clients to dynamically update their DNS records. And the non-supported clients allows DHCP to update their records for you, so that you don't have to go, and we don't have to have Patrick here at 4 o'clock in the morning to update all the DNS that DHCP assigns for us. I know that is the end. Are there questions? You ready to do some labs? Comments? Going once, going twice. Okay, let's take a break.